We're all familiar with organizations. We've all been members of teams, businesses, nonprofits, networks, societies, or some other group of people who came together in order to get something done. And most of us have at least at some point thought, hey, we could be doing this whole thing a lot better. Maybe we experienced an interpersonal dynamic that was really challenging. A leader that was going off the rails, meetings that were endless, cultures that excluded people, or bureaucracies that were pointless. And though all of us know what it feels like when something in the organization isn't working, it's really hard to put a finger on exactly what needs to change. It's as if we're doctors who see a symptom, but we need a big picture view of how the body works in order to diagnose or prescribe. And although many of us have visions of what our ideal organizations might look like, it's really hard to figure out exactly how to create them. It's as if we're architects who know exactly how we want a building to feel, but need specific training to know how to actually design the structure. This is a short presentation for folks who want to create better organizations. It's not another system that promises to solve all your problems. It's just a lens to help you better understand how to start tinkering with your organization. By the end of this little presentation, you'll have a clear framework for seeing the interconnected components of organizations. That framework will help you think more clearly about how to create and transform organizations, leaving you more empowered to actualize your visions. But first, a few words about me. When I asked my friend Benny to take a professional-looking picture of me, we came up with that. When I go to the desert to pray with my fellow Jews, I look like that. As far as my professional identity, I've been facilitating group dialogues and processes for over 10 years, had a short stint as a marching band director, practiced restorative justice in schools and prisons, graduated from law school, and then really rooted in the movement for a just and regenerative economy through working with the Sustainable Economies Law Center. Nowadays, I run a consulting and training practice called Harmonize that helps social movement organizations and purpose-driven companies create cultures of belonging, leaderful structures, and holistic governance and management systems. If you want to get a deeper, more personal sense of me, you can check out simonmont.com. Now to our task at hand. Now, when we look at organizations, we can see 6 interconnected dimensions: culture, structure, rules, processes, practices, and relationships. The delineations between these dimensions aren't always clear, and they often create each other. But it's still useful to point them out because it helps us see just how many points of intervention there are when we're trying to make a shift. This framework is something that I generated by looking at the Australian Indigenous Governance Institute, the Reinventing Organizations wiki site, and then having conversations with partners in the space to synthesize those frameworks with my own consulting experience. In the next couple minutes, I'm going to define and give examples of these terms and share a few implications of the framework. We can start with culture because in some ways it's the soil out of which every other aspect of the organization grows. Now, I have a picture here of one of my favorite murals in Oakland. It's called Universal Language, and it expresses the kind of culture I want to be a part of. And, more importantly, it gives me an excuse to put Oakland street art all over this presentation. Okay. Now back to our task at hand here. So culture can be defined in a lot of ways. I think of it as the assumptions, norms, values that contribute to our social and psychological environment. It's the water that we're swimming in without even realizing that we're fish. And we often only recognize that culture exists at all when we find ourselves embedded in one that's different from the one that we implicitly accept as normal. Some examples of culture. Part of it's the worldview or cosmology. For example, are we thinking that quantifiable and measurable things are more real than non-quantifiable or immeasurable things? Do we think that physical things are more real than etheric, mental, or spiritual things? Do we believe that intellectual ideas are more legitimate sources of information than felt senses? Do we view the natural world as an inanimate object or a living being? And do we think connection to ancestry matters? Now, all of those things and more are part of our worldview and cosmology. Language is another important part of culture. whether it's different native tongues or simply different ways of speaking English. What things are easier or harder to express in one language or another? Were we trained to speak in business school or in art collectives or on farms? And do we value some of these languages and ways of expressing more? Now, there's also values, both stated and unstated. Now, what we consider important or worthy of consideration will influence nearly everything that we do. There's also traditions that we may not even realize as traditions. How we greet each other, how we begin convenings, how we depart for the day. And the ways we see and interpret each other are also subtle elements of culture. For example, if we see someone with a male body walking into a room wearing a dress, we'll all view that person through the lens of our own cultures and make meaning accordingly. We may see the person as a deviant, or we may see the person as courageously committed to their own inner truth. And this way of seeing and interpreting will then impact our behavior. And there are a few cultural norms that are particularly worth mentioning because they're pervasive in American mainstream culture and are connected to the maintenance of systems of oppression. For example, conflict avoidance is very common, but we could also be embracing it. It's common to talk about personal biases or explicit discrimination, and it's less common to view oppression as an expression of a systemic dynamics and then actively transform it. And sometimes we still even intentionally or unintentionally exclude people. And the questions who feels welcome and who feels like they belong all point to what is the culture that's dominant in the space. Every organization has a culture. And if you don't intentionally create one, you'll inherit the one that you've learned to accept as normal. In the context of organizations, particularly professional organizations, the thing accepted as normal is actually a culture founded on white male supremacy that operates to disconnect us from ourselves, each other, and the environment that sustains us. Shifting culture can be very challenging and often involves changes to other dimensions. One of the first steps in shifting it is to make it visible by inviting people to share their experiences of it. From there, you can provide education or shared experience that helps people see and live into new options. Next up is structure. Structure is the formal arrangement of power, responsibility, autonomy, and accountability. It's important to emphasize formal here because there are also informal arrangements of all these things, particularly of power. Now, formal power might exist because someone's in a supervisory role. Informal power might exist because someone possesses special information, social status, or connection to a partner. The most common way to think about structure is the organizational chart. But org charts are really pointing to things like who has the authority to make what decisions, what working groups exist, what's the scope of their work, what roles do people have, and is there anyone in the organization that can tell someone else what to do? Theories of management, particularly new theories of self-management like holacracy and sociocracy, often focus on structure. This can be powerful because of the visibility and formality of organizational structure. Shifts in structure can either cause or even be motivated by shifts in culture. But shifts in structure alone are rarely sufficient to create the organizations we want, and they aren't even always the best places to start. One common place to start making shifts is processes. Now, processes are procedures for accomplishing discrete, time-bound tasks that require coordination or input. Typically, organizations are running many processes at the same time. Now, the thing to point out here is that in this definition, a process has a beginning and an end. It's not something that's happening constantly in the organization. There are other ways to define a process, but this definition is going to give us a payoff, so stay with me for a minute. Seeing processes include things like creating a strategic plan or a budget, hiring or firing a person, onboarding or someone, doing a fundraising campaign, or designing a specific program. Now, seeing a process as a discrete procedure that accomplishes specific tasks lets us notice that we can change a process without creating too much disruption in the rest of the organization. For example, we could change how we hire without really changing much else. This makes processes great places to start piloting ideas or initiating change. Let's say, for example, you want to change your entire hierarchical nonprofit organizational structure to be more emergent and responsive to the input of frontline staff and the needs of your community. That's tough to do. Some people will certainly be skeptical and resistant. So you can start by incorporating some of those values and visions into the strategic planning process. Maybe you conduct extra focus groups, have staff input session, and have a committee of board staff and community members use a consensus building process to finalize the plan. Now, by doing this, you're not only changing the process and the outcome, you're also starting to train the organization to think and operate in a different way. And you can experiment without risking significant disruptions to the whole system. This can lay the foundation for future changes in structure or culture. Practices are the ongoing activities that enable the organization to function. Similar to culture, they often become so much a part of life at the organization that we don't even notice them. They include things like training and coaching, the way we facilitate meetings, the way decisions are made when we're together around the table, or the presence or absence of times for emotional care and connection. Practices are often the most cabined elements of our organizations, which makes them some of the easiest to change or implement. For example, you could implement a practice of a 1-minute meditation at the beginning of meetings, or a practice of managers holding office hours and inviting critical feedback, or practices of gathering as a team for social time once a month, and you wouldn't have to change anything else in the organization. Rules are the explicit directives inside an organization. There's an expectation that people will follow them, but a rule itself is meaningless unless people follow it. We often implement practices or processes to get each other to follow the rules that we set. Rules include things like when and where we work, how much time we take off, what constitutes harassment, or a policy that says we don't send emails after a certain time at night. Making rules can be helpful because it gives us an opportunity to get clear on how we want things to work. They can open great moments of group processing and envisioning, but they don't have much lasting power unless following them becomes a practice, or there are practices and processes to help keep people in alignment. Relationships are the presence and quality of connection between people. How do we feel when we're together? Do we trust each other? Do we have an embodied sense of connection? Is there an undercurrent of competition or an unexpressed conflict? And do we only talk about ideas, or do we also share felt experiences? Do we only talk about work? And if we talk about our personal lives, are we simply reporting occurrences from the past, or sharing vulnerably in order to create connection between each other? When we're looking at our relationships, we can look at relationships between people inside the organization, between people in different groups inside the organization, and between people inside and outside the organization. Oftentimes, our relationships are influenced by cultures, structures, rules, processes, and practices. Noticing the quality of our relationships can indicate that things need to shift in those dimensions. And at the same time, direct changes to our relationships can motivate and set the foundation for changes elsewhere in the organization. For example, if you want to restructure your organization, the more strong, trusting relationships between different people in the organization, the better. Or if you want to change your culture, starting by creating one-to-one relationships that welcome truth-speaking, experience sharing, and vulnerability might be a good place to start. Okay, that was a whole bunch of words and ideas and a heady framework. And it's just time to ask yourself whether this approach helps you imagine how you might tinker with your organization. And it's worth saying that it's not a science. It's not as if some issues are always best addressed by changing structures, while others are best addressed by changing practices. The invitation here is to think creatively about what's going on and how you can begin shifting it. And for example, if you're seeing that people are feeling closed and defensive in meetings, maybe start by building relationships with folks that will invite them to be honest. You might find that there's a cultural norm causing them to feel excluded. Then you might implement a practice of facilitating meetings differently. If the change resonates, you might start to see other places where your culture could shift, and then bring in a facilitator to help the group talk about and process what's going on. That might reveal that people's job responsibilities and lines of accountability are creating tension, so you need a structural shift. Who knows? But the idea is that by seeing your organization in terms of these dimensions, you can realize that there are uncountable opportunities to start making changes. So if you see that there are deep problems with your culture or structure, you don't need to be intimidated, and you don't even need to dive directly into changing them. You can start by shifting practices, processes, relationships, or rules. And if you're trying to create an organization, remember to pay attention to way more than your structure. Even if you create a structure that aligns with everyone's values, unless you tend to the other dimensions of your organization, it's not going to go well. And if this stuff makes sense, if it helps you think about it, or you're just curious, you can reach out to me at simon@harmonize.work, and we can talk about really anything, coaching, training, consulting, or you can call me to tell me I'm wrong about everything. I definitely welcome that. So I hope that your journey toward the organization of your dreams is peaceful and easeful.